stand with me inside the walls of Jerusalem in the spring of 70. The gates behind you have been closed for weeks, and they will not reopen until it is all over, one way or another. Imagine you are here for Passover, like tens of thousands of others crowding these streets right now. Pilgrims, not soldiers, coming to a festival that has marked the course of this city for longer than anyone can remember. The Romans let you in. They will not let you out. And somewhere behind those walls you cannot see, factions within your own people are fighting each other for control of the granaries that should have fed this city until something worse happens. What does it take to destroy a city that is already destroying itself from within? If you want to know the full, honest story of what happened here, not the version either side wants to be remembered for, register now. Many more similar stories await you. The battle that ended on these streets didn't begin here. The story began 4 years earlier, in 66 AD, with a Roman governor named Gessius Florus, who ruled Judea with a combination of financial exploitation and a blatant disregard for the religious beliefs of the local population, to such an extent that even his Roman superiors could hardly justify it. When Florus ordered his soldiers to steal 17 talents of silver from the temple treasury to cover unpaid taxes, a group of Jerusalem youths reacted with mockery. They passed a basket through the crowd collecting coins, as if Florus were a beggar in need of alms. Florus responded with large-scale violence. Soldiers massacred some 6,000 people, and city leaders who opposed him were publicly flogged and crucified. It was the kind of response that failed to restore order. It produced rebellion, the inevitable result of a provincial government that, years before Florus took office, had viewed Judea's religious sensitivities as more of an inconvenience than something to be genuinely managed, and which had finally met a populace with nothing left to lose that had spoken out. By the time the public revolt spread throughout Judea later that year, one crucial fact had shaped everything that followed. The rebellion never spoke with a single voice. Many rebel factions fought side by side rather than under a unified command. The Sicarii, a radical group notorious for assassinating those deemed assassins with concealed daggers, and the various zealot groups pursuing overlapping but differing visions of what victory meant. This division was not healed as the war dragged on. In fact, it deepened, and by the time Rome sent its most capable general to end what 4 years of provincial rebellion had failed to accomplish, it would prove to be one of the most decisive factors in the outcome of this story. That general was Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, and in the spring of 70 AD he arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem with a force composed of 4 legions: the 5th Macedonics Legion, the 10th Fretensis Legion, the 12th Fulminata Legion, and the 15th Apollinaris Legion, a combined army often estimated at around 70,000 men. His strategy was calculated coldly enough to be blunt. Since his arrival coincided with Passover, Titus allowed the usual stream of pilgrims into the city for the festival, then closed the city gates behind them. Adding one more person inside those walls now meant adding one more mouth to feed that Jerusalem's food reserves had to sustain, whether that person came to fight or simply to pray. Surrounding the entire city, Roman engineers constructed a siege wall over 7 kilometers long, completely sealing off Jerusalem, making escape and resupply impossible. This was not chaos. This was policy, a siege designed from the outset to turn the city's very population and logistics into weapons against itself. And within those walls, the Roman siege was not the only force aiming for the same outcome. 3 opposing factions held different areas of the city and different parts of the temple complex. The force led by John of Gishala, the force led by Simon of Giora, and a smaller faction under the command of Eleazar ben Simon. Instead of immediately uniting against the besieging army, these factions spent the crucial first weeks fighting amongst themselves for control of Jerusalem, and in that struggle they committed an act of self-destruction that historians still struggle to fully explain. They burned each other's granaries. These enormous storehouses, stockpiled enough food to sustain the city for years of siege, were deliberately destroyed by opposing Jewish factions, not by anything Titus's army did from outside the city walls. We need to be frank about the implications of this, because it complicates any simple narrative of righteous defenders against an invading empire. The famine that would engulf Jerusalem in the coming months was not entirely, or perhaps even primarily, a Roman achievement. Essentially, it was self-inflicted, a product of ongoing internal power struggles even as a foreign army was building fortifications to besiege the entire city. Only when the Roman construction crews began erecting their own assault fortifications did John of Gishala and Simon of Eurythia set aside their rivalry and unite against the common external threat. a unity that, according to any honest reading of the timeline, was dangerously too late. If the idea that a city's internal politics could inflict damage as great as any besieging army interests you as it does, then our members will have more access to this complex, uncompromising kind of history, first-hand and uncut. It's always available whenever you'd like to learn more with us. Before returning to the walls of Jerusalem itself, it's worth understanding exactly who Josephus is, because his own story is almost as improbable as the siege he describes, and it explains precisely why his account carries the bias it does. Years earlier, Josephus had commanded Jewish rebel forces in the Galilee campaign, one of the war's earlier chapters, before Roman forces under Vespasian defeated and captured him. Facing near-certain execution, Josephus reportedly made a bold prediction to his captors that Vespasian himself would become emperor of Rome. It was on its face an outlandish claim from a defeated enemy commander pleading for his life. Within 2 years, through the chaotic civil war that followed Nero's death, it came true. Vespasian did become emperor, and Josephus, whether through genuine foresight or simple good fortune, found himself transformed overnight from condemned rebel to valued Flavian client, eventually accompanying Titus's campaign against the very city and people he had once fought for. This is the man whose account forms the backbone of nearly everything modern readers know about this siege, a former enemy combatant turned dependent of the family, whose son was now leading the army bearing down on Jerusalem's walls. Keep that transformation in mind every time his narrative happens to cast Titus in the most forgiving possible light. The siege that follows is grinding and methodical, exactly the kind of warfare Roman legions had spent centuries perfecting. Wall after wall falls to Roman engineering and assault. First the outer defences, then successive inner lines, each breach pushing the city's defenders and its increasingly desperate civilian population into an ever-shrinking space. Josephus, the Jewish historian whose account provides most of what survives of this siege in detail, appears in his own narrative not merely as a chronicler but as a participant, a former rebel commander who had defected to the Roman side earlier in the war, and who attempts, unsuccessfully, to negotiate some kind of settlement between the two sides during the siege itself. He is trusted by neither. The rebels view him as a traitor. The Romans have no reason to treat his mediation as anything more than a useful voice shouting toward the walls. His attempts change nothing about where this siege is heading. What the destroyed granaries meant, in practical terms, was months of steadily worsening starvation for everyone still trapped behind Jerusalem's walls, soldiers and uninvolved civilians alike, the elderly and the very young suffering earliest and worst, as famine always sorts its victims by vulnerability rather than by which faction they happen to support. We will not dwell on the details Josephus records from these months in the way some retellings do, because suffering on this scale is not spectacle, and a family's slow starvation inside a city under siege deserves the same respect any atrocity does. Acknowledgement of its reality, not a lingering description designed to shock. What matters for understanding how this siege actually unfolded is simpler and starker. By the time Roman forces breached the city's remaining defences, they were not facing a well-supplied garrison making a heroic last stand. They were facing a population that internal division had already begun starving to death, weeks or months before a single Roman soldier crossed the final wall. Now come back to the walls themselves, to the final days of August, as the fighting reaches the Temple Mount. You can feel the ground shake before you hear it. Roman siege engines, working now against the last and most sacred barrier left standing in the entire city. Smoke is already rising somewhere ahead of you, thick and constant, from fires that have not stopped burning in days. Soldiers are fighting in the narrow spaces around the temple's outer court, close enough that command and chaos blur into the same thing. And then, in the confusion, fire reaches the temple itself, flames climbing walls that have stood in one form or another at the religious heart of this city for centuries. What happens in that exact moment, and whether it happens by accident or by design, is one of the genuine, unresolved disputes at the center of this entire story, and it deserves more honesty than most retellings give it. Josephus's account, written as a client historian dependent on the goodwill of the Flavian imperial family, Vespasian and Titus themselves, describes the fire as an accident. A Roman soldier throws a burning piece of wood into one of the temple's chambers during the chaos of battle, and although Titus supposedly orders his men to extinguish it and preserve the building, the fire spreads too quickly and the order goes unheeded in the confusion. It is a version of events that conveniently absolves Titus of any deliberate responsibility for destroying one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. A different account survives through the 4th century Christian historian Sulpicius Severus, who describes Titus deliberately ordering the temple's destruction, a calculated decision meant to eliminate the religious and political heart of Jewish resistance at its root, ensuring no future rebellion could rally around it again. Severus almost certainly drew this claim from a now lost portion of the Roman historian Tacitus's own account of the war, and while that missing text prevents modern historians from confirming Tacitus's exact wording, scholars studying the surviving fragments generally conclude that Tacitus did present Titus's decision as deliberate and considered, not accidental. We cannot tell you with certainty which version is correct. What we can tell you is that Josephus, the source most popular retellings default to, had every personal and professional incentive to protect his patron's reputation, and that an alternate, independently sourced account describing deliberate destruction survives specifically because it did not depend on staying in the good graces of the man it describes. Treating Josephus's accident as simple, settled fact, the way so much popular history does, ignores exactly how compromised that particular witness actually was. Whatever the true intent behind it, the temple burned. It was captured and destroyed around the 9th or 10th of the Hebrew month of Avar, in late August of 70 AD, a date that Jewish communities have marked with mourning in the centuries since, regardless of which account of causation you find more convincing. What followed across the rest of the city was systematic and brutal. Roman forces moved through Jerusalem's remaining districts, killing, enslaving, or displacing much of the surviving population, razing structures that had stood for generations. Josephus records a death toll exceeding 1 million people across the course of the siege, a figure modern historians treat with substantial skepticism, given the practical limits of the city's actual population and the near impossibility of tracking casualties that precisely in the chaos of a months-long siege. Most contemporary estimates suggest the real toll, while still catastrophic, more plausibly fell in the range of several 100,000 rather than over 1 million. Neither number makes what happened here anything less than one of the deadliest sieges of the ancient world. But the scale of Josephus's figure, like so much else in this story, likely owes something to the dramatic needs of the account being written, rather than a precise census no one in that chaos could ever have actually taken. The physical proof of what Rome took from this city still stands today, in Rome itself. The Arch of Titus, raised near the Roman Forum to commemorate this campaign, depicts Roman soldiers in a triumphal procession carrying looted treasures from the temple, among them the great menorah, rendered in stone detail specific enough that historians still study it today for clues about the original object's actual appearance, down to the shape of its base and the ornamentation along its arms. Unlike so much else in this story, that carving is not filtered through any historian's account, biased or otherwise. It has simply been standing in Rome, in public view for nearly 2,000 years, walked past by millions of visitors who may never learn what specific act of destruction it was built to celebrate, a monument raised by the victors to make certain no one who saw it in antiquity could mistake exactly what, and whose, had been taken. The consequences of what happened here did not end when the fires finally burned out. With the temple destroyed and the priestly, sacrifice-centered form of worship that had revolved around it no longer physically possible, Jewish religious life underwent a transformation whose effects are still visible today. Leadership and religious authority shifted decisively toward rabbis and the study of scripture and law rather than temple ritual, laying groundwork for what would become Rabbinic Judaism, the tradition from which nearly all forms of Judaism practiced in the world today ultimately descend. It would not be the final act of Jewish resistance to Roman rule. A further, even larger uprising would follow decades later under different leadership, but the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD marked the end of the temple as the literal, physical center of Jewish religious life, a rupture whose absence is still marked in Jewish practice and mourning to this day, regardless of which account of the fire you find more convincing. So think back to those sealed gates, to the granaries burning from the inside before a single Roman siege tower ever reached the walls, to a temple that fell to fire under circumstances no source can fully agree on even now. You were never watching a single clean story of conqueror against defender. You were watching a city consumed from two directions at once, a foreign army that had turned Passover itself into a trap, and a defending population too fractured by its own rival factions to unite until unity could no longer save what those same factions had already burned. What remains, once the disputed fire and the inflated numbers are set aside, is a siege that reshaped the religious and political landscape of an entire people for 2,000 years afterward, and a historical record built almost entirely from the words of a man who had every reason to tell it in a way that protected the emperor's son he served. Rome won. That much no source disputes. Exactly how much of what burned that year was lit by Roman hands, and how much by the city's own, that is a question the evidence still cannot fully answer. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the disputed sources weighed honestly, the inconvenient details other retellings leave out, the destruction that came from more directions than the obvious one, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us.